Good morning, everybody. I'm Dimple Abichandani. I'm the executive director of the General Service Foundation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you all from unceded Ohlone territory in Alameda, California. I have medium brown skin, dark brown hair. I'm wearing a cream top and a cream and black jacket, and I'm sitting in front of a multicolored quilt. I have the great honor today of introducing to you all our keynote speaker, Dr. Manuel Pastor. Dr. Pastor is the Distinguished Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income communities and the social movements that are seeking to change those realities. I'm sure many of you have, like me, at times really been grateful for his work because he is truly a movement scholar and just an incredible resource to those of us that are working here in California. I have a lot of appreciation for this. While many of us were struggling just to kind of get through the days during the height of the pandemic, Dr. Pastor wrote not just one, but two books. And today his talk is going to draw on one of those books, Solidarity Economics. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend it. And with that, I'm just going to welcome Dr. Pastor.
Okay, finally. Thank you, Dimple. And I finally figured out the mute unmute after only 2.5 years of Zooming. Really glad to be with you all today. And what I want to do is to talk a little bit about the moment we're in and what it's really calling for us to do in Northern California as a state and really in the nation. And I think the really key thing is to, and this is the title, to understand that there's really not the language of recovery that we need, but the language of reimagination and restructuring, because there really is no going back to a normal that really did not work for so many people, something that became completely evident during the course of the pandemic. COVID has been the disease that revealed our illness, that revealed our illnesses as a society, the racial wealth gap that meant that so many people didn't have a cushion on which they could fall in hard times, the digital divide that meant that so many kids of color were on the wrong side of the possibility of remote learning, the lack of documentation status for so many of our brothers and sisters, which meant that people were frozen out of aid. So these were long-standing inequities that were made worse by the pandemic. You can see here age-adjusted COVID death rates for the county I live in, LA, and Black age-adjusted death rates about twice that for whites, Latinos 3 times, and fascinatingly, Pacific Islander even higher. At the same time, this was a crisis that revealed our mutuality, our need to depend on one another, our recognition that an essential worker was not the manager of a hedge fund, but a grocery store clerk or a truck driver or a healthcare worker. But it's also a crisis that revealed our deep social division, the struggles that occurred around masks within California and certainly within the country and around vaccines. And all of this came in the context too of the murder of George Floyd, which made so many people, some who knew this already, recognize that there was racist policing, but also that that was a tip of a racist iceberg of inequality in the economy, in education, and in the environment. And so we are in a moment of change and reckoning with our past, our present, and our future. And in that sense, there really is no going back to a normal that did not work for so many who were left behind and kept behind. We often use the language of left behind as though it was an accident who was on one side of the sort of terrain or chasms of inequality. But it's really kept behind by an unequal education system, by over-incarceration, by racial discrimination, by redlining, by the lack of legal status, etc. So we need not a recovery, but a reimagination and restructuring. So what does that look like? Like any lapsed Catholic, which I am, everything comes in threes. I still kept that part of the Catholicism. So three big things: the need to center racial equity and the struggle against racism in our work ahead, the need to craft a new economic story that can become common sense, because progressives often lack that economic story. And then finally, a message that I think is very important, particularly given what Northern California grantmakers has been trying to insist on, which is the need to commit to social movements for change, to recognize that what is really going to move the needle is not another one of those really great books that I might write, not another piece of really great research, not another particular political figure. What is really going to move things is strong social movements that can change the terrain of popular understanding, that can change the terrain of political power, that can make it, what we say in Spanish, factible, possible for change to take place. So, these three things. First, we need to, and I'm really going to spend most of my time on the economic story piece of it, say a little bit at the end on movements. So quite quickly, a lesson that's become clear to us is that we need to center racial equity and have a deep interrogation of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, both for its own sake, for the liberation of Black people in the United States, for the recognition of the genocide and land taking that was part of the acknowledgement that we just had, but also because this is what sets the terrain for othering of everyone else. For immigrants, the terrain of othering and xenophobia that they encounter is deeply embedded in anti-Black racism and the way that that structures whiteness in the United States. And so this is a specific kind of struggle, but it's one that's common for all of us in terms of challenging othering and creating what our good friend John Powell calls widening the circle of belonging. This is incredibly important to realize also how deep-seated it is. This is from Los Angeles County, and I should have done it for the Bay Area, but I understand that there's some degree of competition between Northern California and Southern California. I know this because I have friends in Northern California. I know this because I'm married to a woman from Northern California who feels like it was a major act of charity to marry me and then move to Los Angeles. Oh, well. But this is looking at median income inequality. This story exists in the Bay Area as well. And what you can see here is very sharp divides between white families, Black families, Latino families, Pacific Islander, Native American. For example, for white families, the median household income is about $83,000. For Black Angelinos, about $45,000. For Latinos, about $52,000. Here's what's interesting. If you look at the exact same chart for families with children using the same scale, look what happens to those inequalities. For families that are white with children, median household income almost $125,000. For Black and Latino families, about $51,000. So the racial inequality that we can see just looking at households is actually much worse when we start looking at households who are raising children. So we are really in the process of baking inequality into the future. And unless we tackle that, we're going to have severe challenges overall for our economy. So part of what we need to do is to center the struggle for racial equity. A second thing that we need to do is to craft a new economic story, one that moves us away from a focus on the individual, from a celebration of markets, from a lack of recognition of our mutuality. And that is what our new book is about, which is called Solidarity Economics: Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. Now, one of the wonderful things about finishing a book is when you first get it in your hands, you can look at the cover and you can say, my gosh, that is a beautiful cover. And I think, Dimple, you will agree. It's quite a beautiful cover. You can also then fantasize about the movie that will be made and who it is who will star for you in that movie. So you can do all that stuff when you first get a book. It's very exciting. The frustrating thing when you first get a book is you realize you could have said the whole thing in 3 sentences. So let me save you a little bit of time. These are the 3 key sentences or takeaways from this book that I think should change the way we talk about economics and should help craft a story for the Bay Area as well as for the rest of California. First big thing is we should always talk about our economy and not the economy. When you say the economy, it sounds like a set of laws given by God or nature, the market, which somehow determine things without reflecting any constellation of power. When you say our economy, it makes sure that you are recognizing that it's all of us who build this economy, and also that it's all of us who set the terrain or the rules that lead to either prosperity or inequality. So, and think about this just in terms of language. The example I've used often, and I'll get back to it, is that while there's significant evidence against this, as we now know, a lot of people will say raising the minimum wage is bad for the economy. It's pretty hard to say it's bad for our economy because when you recognize that it's our economy, there are people who are working at the minimum wage and that they will benefit, you can understand that it's good for our economy. So we need to stop talking about the economy and start talking about our economy. Second thing is that we need to shake a habit that even progressives have, which is that we often talk about equity, fairness, and inclusion as though they're costly. That is, and I don't to argue that there aren't some cases in which there is actually sort of an equity efficiency trade-off, where what you're trying to do that's a little bit fairer might actually cost you a little bit in terms of GDP or prosperity or overall well-being. But the fact of the matter is that this level of inequality that we've got in our society actually costs us economically. When you have so many people who've been incarcerated and find it difficult to connect to credit afterwards, to connect to work, you're wasting so much talent. When you got so many people who are living in the shadows of an immigration system that refuses to treat them like full human beings, that's entrepreneurship and productivity that is going to waste. When you've got the level of income inequality I was talking about before that condemns a next generation to being on the wrong side of a digital divide, to getting schooling that isn't adequate, to growing up in poverty, you are creating an inability for people to be able to succeed economically going into the future. And study after study from such left-wing organizations as the Federal Reserve and the International Monetary Fund have been showing that inequality actually damages the ability to sustain our economy. In our own book earlier, Equity, Growth, and Community, we looked at metropolitan regions around the United States, and we said, what allows you to sustain job growth? 3 big dragging factors, aside from ones you'd normally think about, like, industrial diversity, universities that would be around, et cetera. Here are the level of initial inequality, the level of residential segregation by race, the level of political fragmentation. When we are divided, when we don't see each other, we wind up not being able to forge our economy in a way that works for nearly all of us. So we need to own the equity argument as an argument about fairness, but also an argument about correcting what's wrong in our economy and allowing it to unleash potential creativity and and all of our talents. Now, we also need to recognize that although that is true, some people benefit from the current set of arrangements. One of the reasons why the 1% has run away from the rest of us. So, in order to change things, we need to have social movements that can be able to amass the political and community power and be able to shift policies. This is incredibly important. In our book, we talk about how things change through a combination of facts, feelings, and force. Facts, when you amass enough evidence so that you understand that you should change things. That's what's happened with the minimum wage. Research over and over again showing us that raising the minimum wage doesn't cost employment. Feelings, that's about intuitive common sense. If you start thinking not that the market will solve our problems, but that mutuality and often our government will help us to solve our problems in a way that works, that's a different set of feelings or common sense. And that kind of thing happens when, for example, in minimum wage thing, when people began to talk about a living wage, which made sure that everybody else on the other side was for a wage that you couldn't live on. But the final thing that changes things is force. And that force is power, community power, and it's also the force of our institutions. So movements are important for that reason, but movements are also important because they help to generate the habits of solidarity, intersectionality, and mutuality. Just as markets make us selfish, when we operate in markets, we are rewarded for acting in our self-interest, and it reinforces that instinct and that behavior. Movements make us mutual. They teach us to bridge between communities. They teach us that we have common interests. They teach us to understand someone else's struggle as your own. So movements serve that double function, and they need to be part of our equation. So what difference does this framework make? Well, we begin to see the importance of the care economy. You all are in the Bay Area. When we think the Bay Area, we think high tech, and we think that that's driving your economy forward. The blue line here is high tech employment in California, and you can see that it's increased quite a bit since 1990. It's almost doubled. But look at the orange line. The orange line is nursing, elder, family, home health, and child care services. There are far more jobs, and it's rising far more rapidly because we're aging in California. So when we think about where we really have our new economy, it's a care economy where we're taking care of our elders and our young, and we need to make sure that the pay is there to be able to make a difference in that. Big thing here is also to recognize that our economy is composed of several things at the same time. Behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and gardeners and food service workers. Every place you're going to grow biotech and high tech, you're also going to grow what is often talked about as low skill employment. It's not low skill. Have you ever tried to take care of your own kids? Have you ever tried to take care of a parent? Have you ever tried to sweep a building to make sure that it's clean for the next day? Have you ever tried to serve a dish to an impatient customer? Those are skilled jobs. They're just not rewarded with the wages that they deserve. So we could go through a few other examples about social housing, about understanding that technology, while it often leads to huge profits for our high-tech companies, that what those high-tech companies are really digging into is a commons of knowledge, research knowledge that's been generated by your tax dollars, and they're tapping into consumer data that is generated by your interactions in the commons. And while they are able to appropriate a private profit from that, why shouldn't they be giving back in the form of a technology dividend or a solidarity dividend for their use of our commons? So we would see things that are a lot different if we were to adopt this solidarity economics framework. But what I want to close on is the following thing. What do I think you should be taking away from this short talk? I was inspired by talking before this conference with Dwayne, and with Dwayne sharing to me the priority that Northern California Grantmakers has put on five big shifts that they are insisting are very important. The need for donors to move from being donor-centered to being community-centered. The need to move from addressing symptoms to fixing systems. The need to stop focusing in on individual action and think about collective action. the need to stop focusing in on limited investments and instead think about leveraged investments, that is working with others to make these investments. And finally, the need to move from outdated practices to updated practices. Dwayne, 5 really great shifts. But I couldn't get out of my head that you really should have a top 10 list. I mean, David Letterman had one. He was pretty successful. You could be sacrificing an entire career in late night television by not putting in 5 additional shifts. So, in the spirit of launching your television talk show career and also trying to raise up a few additional points, here's 5 more shifts that I hope that everybody keeps in mind. The first is to stop tackling equity later and start stressing equity up front. My expression for this is when we are thinking about economic development, we need to make sure that equity is baked in, not sprinkled on. So not that we're going to develop our tech sector or try to grow, we're going to try to recover our economy and then repair some of the damage that was done during the pandemic. No, start where the hurt has been the hardest. Start where the trauma has been the deepest. Start where the disadvantage has been the starkest. And when you invest there, when you repair those systems, when you build our economy that kind of a way, it's going to be more robust, more able to survive crises in the futures. Second thing that is part of the additional 5 for the top 10 is to stop picking issues and instead work on intersections. So not to focus in just on housing, just on transit, just on immigration, just on policing, but to start looking at where there are intersections between those issues. You do that because people's lives are not experienced through the prism of just one experience. But you also do it, as I mentioned before, we often think about social movements as instrumental. Community organizing is instrumental. It is a means to achieving a policy end. But social movements and community organizing are fundamental. They create a different we. They create a situation in which we are transformed to care about others, to express our mutuality and solidarity. And when you work at the intersections, you are building the bridges and the formations for stronger movements. We also need to move from projects and policy to a fundamental goal of building community and movement power. When you start to think about what will strengthen communities to be able to articulate their interests later, rather than to think about a specific policy win, when you begin to think about a campaign in terms of how we'll build power over time, this is a shift in thinking and in investment. Fourth big add-on is to move from highlighting collaboration to embracing conflict. My shorthand for this is that equity often comes to the table kicking, screaming, and protesting. If we are expecting that all of our conversations about becoming a fairer and more inclusive Bay Area will always be polite, will always be respectful, will always be people getting along, then we're not prepared for dealing with the anger, trauma, hurt, righteous anger that is out there. And when we often highlight collaboration, it's often about bringing together people that we usually work with. And instead, I like to think about collaboration as principled conflict, bringing together people where there might be some conflicts, but there's principles about how to conflict together with respect, with dignity, with a willingness to return again to the conversation, and also some principles, of course, about what you agree on. Finally, I really hope that we begin to shift from the language of recovery to the language of restructuring, to think about how we, it's very clear that we were not robust, or we could not have been so hard hit by the pandemic in the general public health sense, but also by the fragility of our Black and Brown and Pacific Islander and low income and indigenous communities. And so we need to strengthen all of that, reimagine all of that, and think about a very different future. So if you want to learn a little bit more, last book was State of Resistance. And as Dimple mentioned, 2 new books actually came out last year. I guess pandemic was very, very good to me. So one of them, Solidarity Economics, captures a lot of this. And Dwayne, you'll be amazed that for an academic, actually ended on time. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor. Not surprised, although highly impressed, because there's so much you could say. And so I appreciate you bringing this into a bit of a digest for us to think about. I want to acknowledge some folks are having a little trouble finding the chat space, but keep submitting those chats in and questions in. I've got a couple of things that have come up, and I actually want to start with the question that came up for me this morning at the grocery store. I was making a quick run before getting ready for the conference, and I got to the counter and was shocked, as we all are, what the bill was, and not just because of my lack of restraint. And so I referenced this to the checkout clerk, and he said, "Yeah, it's really tough right now." He says, "But they talk about raising wages. They're just going to pass those costs on to us. That's not going to work either." I said, "Well, there's got to be some way to stop that from happening." And he said, "Yeah, but that's socialism." And I said, "Well, there's got to be a choice besides socialism and capitalism," just engaging with him. And he said, "Yeah, monarchy? I don't know." So we laughed, but I was struck by this frame that so many everyday people have, that to do anything differently than the economy we have moves to a narrative that is a third rail, that is completely unacceptable. How do we start to shift the narrative so people can understand that we have alternatives about how this economy could transform?
This is such a good point. And what we like to do, my colleague Chris Benner and I, as we think about this, is that, for people who are more conservative, the answer is always the market. That is, that if you've got a housing crisis, the market will solve it by creating more housing. If you've got a jobs crisis, the market can solve it by lowering people's wages. That if you've got a environmental crisis, well, that might be a market imperfection, but cap and trade is your remedy for that. And too often what gets counterposed on the other side is the government. The government's going to solve housing. The government is going to solve racial discrimination. The government is going to solve our problems. I do think that one of the things that we need to be focusing in on is turning to each other. I think a lot of communities, and not just conservative communities, don't trust the government. That's been part of the problem with getting vaccines to low-income communities of color, because the idea that the government's showing up with actually something that might be good for you after decades of showing up only with stuff that's bad for you was something that really met the sort of distrust wall. So I think we need to talk about that. We also need to shift the common sense. I'm lucky enough to have an endowed chair at the University of Southern California. And I once asked the person who endowed it, quite wealthy, that how did he make his money? And he said, well, I treated my customers right. I treated my workers right. I treated my suppliers right. And as a result, the business was successful and grew. And we know that our highest performing, best companies are ones that actually take into account mutual interests and try to govern in that particular way. So I think that's an important part of common sense that we need to get across. The other thing that I think in this current moment we need to stress is what's happened to the distribution of income, particularly over the last few years, which is that there's been an extraordinary distribution shift toward the wealthiest, and really for very little that they wound up doing, but simply being in the right place at the right time. And of course, we've seen this, for example, in the state of California, basically everyone making more than $150,000 a year pretty much did not suffer during the pandemic in terms of wage loss or employment loss. When you went to below 50,000, huge losses in terms of employment and wages, and obviously challenges with rent being due and that kind of a thing. So there's tremendous inequality, and we need to sort of think about what we need to do to close that gap and focus the conversation in on that. Why are prices rising so much? Some of it has to do with things we think about, like the ability of the government to get us through this pandemic by putting money into the economy. Some of it has to do with the sky high profits that are in some sectors of the economy and continue to persist.
I appreciate that. And it led to a question I think that came from the audience about the argument we make with those who are experiencing such wealth acceleration to see this as not a zero-sum game, that they stand to lose if we collectively are losing at a widespread rate across the society. And any messages you've been able to see that resonate with folks who are accumulating wealth right now?
Well, I do think that there's I had an interesting experience. Some years ago, I went and gave a talk, believe it or not, to Deutsche Bank in New York. And afterwards, a bunch of people queued up for questions, as you would expect. The US president of Deutsche Bank queued up for question and actually let everybody else hang around and ask their question first. I kept thinking, this guy's losing a lot of money by waiting for me. But the question he came up to me afterwards and spent 15, 20 minutes talking about was his own deep concern that this level of inequality was dashing people's expectations that they would ever get ahead, was creating a playing field where talent wouldn't be able to rise, was creating social tensions that would snap back and create an unsustainable political situation. So I think that those arguments can be made and should be made. I also think we need to realize, your former boss, my good friend, Angela Glover Blackwell, always reminds us that during the civil rights movement, Bull Connor, the famous sheriff in Birmingham, never came around. A lot of people in the South did come around and realize, oh my God, Jim Crow's a bad thing. How do we dismantle it, even though they were benefiting from it? But certain people never came around. I have no expectation that Peter Thiel or Elon Musk are going to have an epiphany. But I do think that there's a lot of people who are wealthy right now who understand that this is corrosive to us as a society and that it's resulting in lost economic gains for really the broader society.
Great, thank you. By the way, we have about 5 minutes left in the Q&A, and if you want to make a comment or find the chat, you can refresh your page and then click on Watch Live here, and then click on Closing Plenary Session, in case people are still trying to find their way. I want to get to this notion of, you mentioned baking in these inequities for the next generation. There's no shortcut, obviously, but what can we do to interrupt that cycle right in this moment when our young people are experiencing interruptions in their education process, watching their parents struggle to make rent? Are there any interventions we can make that can short circuit this a little bit?
It's funny, the thing that I would suggest is to invest in youth organizing and youth healing. And I suggest this because one of the things we know from both experience and research is that young people who kind of go through social justice, leadership development, community organizing, etc., develop an analysis of the structures that impact them. And so they're much more able to be resilient going forward. So we know that someone who has had social justice leadership, social justice training, who goes to college, if they have challenges in their first classes, problem with their first test, they don't immediately blame it on themselves, but they understand that that's the result of the structural inequities of the kind of schools that they went to. They're going to work harder at the next test, but they've got a different story about who they are, their lives, and how they can change things. I think it's also important because increasingly youth organizing has a healing component to it. And I think why that's important is there is so much mental health trauma out there as a result of the pandemic. All of us had hard times. All of us have family members or friends who were lost in this pandemic, or people whose lives were derailed. My son is a musician who is on a national tour heading into New York City on March 13th, 2020. His musical career got significantly derailed over the last couple of years. That's really hard. But for our young people of color, they saw family members die. They saw a government that did not pay attention to them. They saw schools that were inadequate already, winding up not being able to deliver the kind of remote learning that was necessary to be able to stay connected. The level of over policing didn't go away. People's parents were still susceptible to being picked up by immigration and customs enforcement, despite the pandemic, et cetera. So the mental trauma that's there is really serious, and youth organizing is part of that. Also, once youth are organized, they're going to fight for better education. They're going to fight for baby bonds so that young people can have a start in life and be able to get ahead. They're going to fight for a fair economic system. They're going to fight like the Dreamers have for immigration reform. They're going to fight for reform of policing like young folks who've been part of Black Lives Matter have done. So again, I would think about investments in youth organizing that has a healing component and bridge building component to it.
Thanks. We're going to close with two more questions and one comment. The comment was an appreciation. Thank you, Dr. Pastor, for lifting up the care economy, especially as elder caregiving, an area that is grossly underfunded in philanthropy and hasn't until recently gotten the attention it needs. The first of the last two questions is, we see some corporate, I won't say pioneers, but some corporations who are thinking about issues differently and thinking of this frame, much more the exception than the rule. Some of them are our members. But my question to you is, what do we do to make that a movement within the corporate sphere, which could really accelerate this change?
So I'm really taken by the strategies of the Restaurant Opportunities Center, it's now called One Fair Wage. And what they've done in the restaurant industry, I'll be quick, is combine strategies. So they've worked on organizing workers so workers have more voice. They've worked on creating co-op, mutually owned restaurants as an alternative. They've worked on policy and government action, but they've also worked on supporting high road restaurants that pay their workers a better wage, that are dealing with the racial discrimination that separates a lot of folks of color from being able to have the best frontline jobs, et cetera. And I think that's one of the things that we need to do, is to try to figure out which businesses are doing better, which businesses are allies, how do we make consumers aware of that, and how do we help those businesses grow? And I think we're in an enormous opportunity to do this because, number one, we've got a lot of younger business executives who actually, like many other younger people, have recognized what I said before, that racist policing is the tip of the racist iceberg, that are just, very unhappy with the level of racial and income inequality and want to see their businesses do something about it. We're also seeing the fact that we have got a right wing which is trying to, and may quite soon, get rid of a woman's right to choose, or get rid of the ability of transgendered employees to live their fullest selves. And lots of businesses are beginning to recognize that those kinds of attacks are actually also bad for business as well. I think one thing progressives haven't been very good at is that they wind up having an anti-business attitude instead of trying to think about how do we grab those businesses that can be allies, how do we marginalize those businesses that are bad actors, and how do we change the terrain so that more businesses move to the high road.
Thanks. Final question for you. I know when you do a book, it's a thing, and you really get to see the whole landscape. So you're seeing a lot of what's happening right now. The world is burning. What gives you hope in this moment?
Well, I'm sort of hopeful or optimistic by nature. I sometimes say that I'm the kind of person who can walk into a room that's full of manure and say, wow, there must have been a pony here. So I'm just optimistic by nature. But I think what gives me hope is that these are difficult times. These are dangerous times. They are going to require us to act with boldness, with vision, with courage, and in solidarity. And what gives me hope is that we do have a vibrant set of social movements that have been able to really change the terrain of California. We've got social movements in Georgia, which are the movements that wound up giving us the state of Georgia and 2 Democratic senators that helped to tip the balance at the federal level. And all of those sectors, if we were to invest more in them, really do hold the possibility of building more bridges, building a bigger movement, and shifting the terrain to make the good things that so many of you want to see happen possible. So, as you might guess, what gives me hope is movements. What gives me hope is that my good friend Dwayne Marsh is heading NorCal Grantmakers and is also pushing hard on this movement button as a vehicle for actually changing the world.
Appreciate you as always, Dr. Pastor. In the before times, this is where we'd all give you the standing ovation. You'll have to settle for knowing that we all are snapping and clapping in front of our screens. So thank you for being with us, and thanks for the work you do. Speaking of people who inspire, I want to invite Dimple Abhijitani back to the stage, if she can. For those of you who know Dimple, and giving her a bit of an introduction, you know my challenge. If you don't know her, just know that she's one of the most thoughtful, strategic, and grounded people that you'll ever meet in philanthropy, or frankly, anywhere. The General Services Foundation really investing in movement building, the kind of things Dr. Pastor was speaking of earlier. Sometimes they're mentors you seek, sometimes you just discover them. And for me, Dimple in the last year and a half since I've joined the board has become a find. Just an amazing board member, an asset to philanthropy and to community, and someone I'm pleased to call a friend. So Dimple, we've asked to share a few reflections on what she's heard over the last day and a half as we approach the close of the panel. So I'll hand it to you.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. I have a kind of unwritten rule that I will say yes to anything that Dwayne asks me to do. But now that I have to follow Dr. Pastor and that incredible presentation, I'm rethinking my automatic yes rule. But actually, I'm really honored to have this opportunity just to share some reflections on the really rich conversations that have happened over the last 2 days. I'm going to start with something I wrote down that Dr. Pastor said. He said, "We are in a moment of change and reckoning." It's very true, right? I also think for those of us who are in the philanthropic sector, as I reflect on conversations that I've been having over the last few months, I think we are in an important moment of making meaning of this experience that we've all gone through. Right? Of really trying to understand, with everything that's happened over the last 2.5 years, what does it mean for how we do our work? So I want to just share sort of some personal reflections of things that I've been meditating on as I reflect on the early days of the pandemic and the lessons that I want to bring into our philanthropic practice. In the early days of the pandemic, I think I was really struck by a deep, deep longing that I saw in our society for us to all be in it together, right? So I think about those early narratives of the pandemic and how often we said, well, COVID is an equalizing force. COVID means that we really are in this together. We're interdependent. I think about those 7:00 moments, right, where people would walk out of their homes to clap for essential workers, to clap for healthcare workers, right? What was that if that wasn't an embodied act of saying we are in this together, right? I think about 26 million people in this country who marched for racial justice, right? That probably includes many of you who are listening right now. Many of you who might have for the first time walked out of your home and onto the streets to say, no, this is not who we are, right? We want to be a place where everyone belongs. So one of the things I'm taking away from the pandemic is that we have this deep longing for being a society where we are all in it together. And then the second thing I'm taking out of the pandemic is that we actually were not in it together. And I don't have to say that much about this fact because Dr. Pastor had really great slides, right? So he broke down for us that the pandemic showed us that race and class and power, they're not just sort of things that we should maybe be talking about, but they're actually matters of life and death, right? They are determinative. And there's hardly anything that we as philanthropy can accomplish if we are not centering these things that are determinative. So we want to be in it together. The reality is that we are not in it together. To sort of bring in something that Dwayne said on day one, he said, philanthropy is about power, right? So I came into this conference in my search for meaning making, really thinking about what is a philanthropy that is a philanthropy of solidarity. So, and I promise, Dr. Pastor, I'm not trying to steal your title. But I think that's actually what we have been talking about over the last 2 days is a solidarity philanthropy. And I think we've been talking about it because I think that our old way of doing philanthropy has been proven to be ineffective, right? So having the strategic plans that McKinsey Consulting has put together for us, and then seeing our grantees as subcontractors, accountable to us, where we are not accountable to them and accountable to these strategies. I think part of the meaning making is that didn't work. That doesn't work, and it didn't work. But how exciting that we've actually seen a lot that does work, right? And over the last 2 days, we've talked a lot about things that work. And so just to highlight, a solidarity philanthropy is one that acknowledges the power that we have as funders. It's about us leaning into our power as funders and using that power to shift who has power in our society, to shift the structural norms. And so it's not like a little bit of change around the edges, right? So that's the important thing to realize about it. And that's what's heartening about what I've heard over the last 2 days is we're not talking about changing a small policy here and a small policy there. A few more people have healthcare. No, we're actually talking about re-envisioning the narratives and re-envisioning the structures. We're talking about centering the social movements that in this time are actually building a more just future, and that in all times have been responsible for change, right? So a solidarity philanthropy has us following the lead of social movements. It has us investing in our democracy in a moment when we are looking at deep fragility and vulnerability. It has us understanding that it's people who have power, right? Not funders. It's people who have power, and that we get to use our power to build theirs. So lots of wisdom I'm taking away from this conference. I have huge gratitude for it. The last thing that I will sort of add and I guess invite you all into is that the pandemic and the challenges that sort of we both have gone through and that we still face are not challenges that any of us, however big your foundation is, none of us can sort of do this alone. And so I am so grateful that we don't have to do it alone, and that we have opportunities to be in beloved community with one another through the Northern California Grantmakers, and that we can try new things together, that we can learn from each other, and we can build the sort of community that will allow us to really meet this moment. Huge gratitude to all of you for this conference, and to the NCG team for this chance to share reflections. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dwayne.
Great. Thank you so much, Dimple. You say you know better than to follow Dr. Pastor. I really know better than to follow Dr. Pastor, followed by you. So, and yet here I am. Because they asked me to do a short closing and thanks, when we were making the program, the thanks are abundant. Obviously, I want to thank the sponsors and the partners, our producers who had us looking smooth through the whole event, our board who's been committed to me from day one, my leadership in this organization, our staff, I don't want to brag, but maybe I should say, and the best team in the PSO sphere. It would be negligent not to lift up in particular Neptali Ramirez, Kayla Ballard, Fong Kwok, the team between our communications and membership who have driven and led the process for the whole conference. And I'll just say that if you had a good vibe and an easy feeling coming off of day one, our reception, that was all Neptali. So you now know how she rolls. So obviously a lot of thanks to everyone and you guys as members, because it's the reason we do it. They asked for a closing, but I don't think I have one. I think what I have is an opening. I hope you're taking what happened over these last couple of days and that something moved you. Something over the last 2.5 days touched you as a possibility. If it didn't, you needed to unmute your phone, your computer, and listen closely, because this has been some amazing stuff. And so my request of you, or I'll implore you, use it. Take that thing, that idea. Don't do what we sometimes do in philanthropy. Say, oh, that's an interesting idea for another time. Let's take that thing and figure out how you move on it. Let's be the sector that Northern California deserves. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being NCG. We'll see you sometime very soon. Have a great afternoon.